Is the US heading for recession? It's the question everyone wants answered because it still needs to be answered. The housing market may actually hold the key to be able to do so. Not just in terms of houses being sold or the number of homes built, more so the downstream impact on jobs, jobs, jobs. Joining me now to connect all of these dots and a whole bunch more, I assure you, by very popular demand, Eric Basmajian of EPB Macro Research.
Yeah, let me zoom out and kind of explain my overall framework for people that may not be familiar and how I look at the economy. So everyone is generally familiar with the sine wave that represents the business cycle. We've all seen this sine wave, and people say, okay, I understand that represents the sine wave, the business cycle. But it's important to actually break down what that sine wave is representing. Now, some people say, well, that's got to be GDP or that's got to be employment or something like that. What that sine wave is actually representing is what we would call aggregate economic activity. So how do we define aggregate economic activity? Well, the National Bureau of Economic Research does that for us. They have this whole business cycle dating procedure. And it's a little bit more involved than just looking at GDP or is there 2 negative quarters, which
the technical definition.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So what they lay out on in their recession or business cycle dating procedure is that aggregate economic activity is made up of 6 monthly variables that we can all track. Non-farm payroll employment, the employment level, which comes from the household survey. So it's important to look at both of them. Real personal consumption, real personal income, real manufacturing, trade and sales, or real retail sales, if you want to get a little bit less specific, and then industrial production. So from a high level, we have income, consumption, production, and employment. All 4 of them are equally important, and all 4 of them are interrelated, right? You can only produce or you can only consume what you produce. You can only consume, what you earn. And there's a circular flow to the way that the cycle moves. So what I do and what I publish to clients is a composite of all 6 of those indicators put together. There's a little bit of weightings and statistics involved, but we aggregate them all together and we can just track that on a monthly basis. And that's our most objective reading of what's going on with the U.S. economy. It's not, my opinion. I'm not cherry picking these things. We put them together and that represents our sine wave or our aggregate economic activity. When that's contracting, that's a recession by definition. When it's expanding, you're obviously not in a recession. So that's the target. However, we want to get a little bit ahead of that. We want to try and get a sense of where those things are going.
Yeah, so, how do you get there, right? Exactly. It's great that when you know that it's happening, but how do we forecast?
Which is half the battle, by the way, because we sit here arguing with people all the time about the direction of the economy, but it's a very objective measure. Right. It's not like, it's amazing that if you take 10 people and you put them in a room, they're all going to have a different opinion of what's going on with the economy. So it's really important to actually agree on the objective definition. Now, people may say, well, I don't care about that. I care about the stock market. And that's fine. But we can't make comments about the quote unquote economy or what's going on with the business cycle without just first agreeing to that very objective set of criteria that we use to define it.
Are you saying we need to be data dependent?
Exactly. Right. So the second thing about the business cycle that I think is really important for everyone to understand is that aggregate economy, what we just described, doesn't represent every person individually. It represents the average person or the average business or just a accumulation of aggregate economic activity. But there are certain components to the economy that move earlier than the average, and there are certain components that move later than the average. Take them all together, and of course you get the average, but you really have to break down the sequence of the way that the cycle moves, because when you go back in time, there is a very consistent sequence that is true of every single recession going all the way back since we've had business cycles. There really are no exceptions to the sequence. There are lots of different lead and lag times, and there are some nuances to every single cycle, but the overall sequence remains the same. Every recession is also different because the recession gets labeled or named after the shock that ultimately defines what that recession is all about. But the lead up to that shock, or the sequence in which we get there, is always very much the same.
The example don't get confirmation until like a year later sometimes. So it's always looking exactly backwards rather than looking forward.
That's exactly right. So when, the example that I always give, and, I'm not relating this business cycle to 2008. I'm just giving it as an example because it was the most recent full business cycle that we've had, was that if you speak to anybody in the residential housing or residential construction sector, they very much felt a recession in late 2006. Certainly by early 2007. The official recession was not dated until December of 2007. And if you speak to someone that may be in a more lagging sector like non-residential construction, I have some clients in that sector of the economy, and they didn't feel really any slowdown until late 2009, almost 2010. So here you have two people that can be in a room saying, I fully feel a recession in my industry in 2006, and another person that's not feeling it until 2010. It's a 4-year difference. It's really, really significant, which is why I present what I call a 4 economies framework. I look at what we would call the leading economy, or leading indicators as they're traditionally known. Then I look at the cyclical economy. Then I look at the aggregate, which we defined, and then I look at the lagging economy. Just to quickly run through what's in those, the leading economy generally represents the availability of money and credit, because of course that's what sort of originates the cycle. When money and credit starts to get tighter or easier, that ripples through the sequence. So we're looking at various changes to monetary and credit aggregates, the yield curve, things like that would fall into that very leading economy. We're not really measuring hard economic data there. It's more soft concepts, soft commitments, things that are generally representative of how easy it is or how willing people are to use credit effectively. The cyclical economy, which is really the engine, that's where recessions live and die, is in that cyclical economy. That's represented by residential construction, not total construction. It really is specific to residential construction activity, manufacturing activity, the consumption of big, bulky, durable goods, things like autos, washing machines, dishwashers, appliances. So we're looking at those 3 categories, both the output and employment associated with those categories. Then, of course, we have the aggregate, which we defined, which is the broad measure of income, consumption, production, and employment. And then we have the lagging economy, which, of course, is just everything else, which is where your healthcare, government spending activities predominantly, non-residential construction, and most of the service sector. So whenever we hear people talking in financial media, almost always they're talking about either the aggregate or the lagging economy. Yeah. Or they're talking about services consumption. We hear a lot about how, non-residential construction, healthcare. These are all things that will give you absolutely no indication of where the cycle is going. In fact, they don't even contract in every recession. It's the cyclical economy, that residential, manufacturing, the goods economy. That's really where we have to spend our time focusing. And that really tells the whole story about this cycle, what's the same, what's different. So that's the framework that I put forward that, of course, we update every month. And it really gives you a good picture of exactly what's going on. It's almost like a dial. You could see exactly what sectors are contracting, what sectors are expanding. And I can't stress enough, it's that cyclical economy that is really everything. If that's not contracting, you can't have a recession.
So it's basically it's that you're talking about a business cycle that kind of snakes through these different stages. Just to back up and review what you said here, is that it
Exactly
starts
right.
off in the leading indicators, which is money, credit. Which I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense. Certainly to people who watch Eurodollar University. So
Absolutely.
you got the leading indicators, and then it starts to make an impact on the cyclical stuff, the goods economy, the durable goods, major ticket items. Because if you can't borrow funds, it's hard to buy a car, right? That kind of a thing,
Yep.
which makes sense. And then if the cyclical economy starts to turn lower, that puts pressure on other sectors and it becomes self-reinforcing. And then the aggregate economy starts to show symptoms, and maybe it experiences different levels of downturn at different times, and it starts to flow together where you start to see more visible signals of a downturn. And maybe it hits the lagging stuff, maybe it doesn't, or it hits the lagging stuff, but maybe it doesn't impact it as in a straightforward fashion as maybe people have it in mind. But basically what you're describing is an intuitive process from the very beginning all the way through to the end. And of course, then you've got the upside too, because we're not just talking about recession, we're also going to be talking about recovery at some point too, or at least reflationary period. So that's why I really love how you've broken down the economy. And you're right. We look at things I don't want to say we look at things very differently, but we look at the economy and the process from different perspectives and different angles. And we kind of focus our effort and attention into the leading indicators and the cyclical indicators. And I think that's one of the most valuable insights that you can give is you got to everybody wants to downplay manufacturing, but the goods economy tends to be where, like you just said, business cycles live and die.
Right,
and that's where
right.
I think a lot of people are having a lot of problems in this cycle, because you look at the goods economy, that leading part leading into the cyclical part, and the cyclical part kind of looks confusing to a lot of people because it doesn't look like, isn't it supposed to go straight down? Isn't that what a recession is? The cyclical part means it's either growing and then it goes into contraction and recession.
Well, you're exactly right. And I think where we overlap a little bit here is that goods economy, manufacturing, durable goods, the manufacturing and transportation of those items, it really is a global process, right? Because not all the goods are manufactured here. Maybe they're assembled here. They certainly have to be transported here once they get into the country to their final destination. All of those things we're picking up in the cyclical economy. But with your focus on the Eurodollar market, that is such a global market that whole process has a interconnectedness globally, which is why manufacturing cycles around the world are pretty synchronized. So you will see that pop up in the more global markets like the US Treasury market or the Eurodollar market, of where those things either see expansions or contractions. Your point about the, isn't the cyclical economy just supposed to nosedive? A lot of times, yes. A lot of times it does. Sometimes it doesn't. We haven't had a traditional business cycle in a very long time, partly because the business cycle from 2009 to 2020 was so weak globally that there weren't huge amplitudes in the cycle. It was kind of just this really muted. I mean, there were, of course, the cyclicality to it, and we had some quasi recessions, in 2015, 2016, 2018, 2019. None of them manifested into a full business cycle recession. And then, of course, we had COVID, which may or may not have developed into a recession. We'll never know. But that was a very man-made process, which kind of threw a wrench into traditional business cycles. The last business cycle that we had was the 2008 cycle, and that cyclical economy was just straight off the diving board and just was like the most intense contraction really we've seen since maybe some of the 1970 recessions. But yes, traditionally, once the leading indicators contract and money and credit gets very tight, those cyclical sectors usually start to contract pretty quickly. And once they start to contract, like you said, it feeds on itself and it continues to spiral through. What we're seeing now is a little bit different in the sense that that cyclical economy coming out of COVID as a result of the reopening as well as some of the stimulus was pushed to extremely elevated levels. We're talking about 9, 10, 11% real growth rates for that cyclical economy. We're talking like, 5 times trend levels of growth for that part of the economy. When the Fed started tightening policy and you could see the symptoms of money and credit getting a little tighter, leading indicators started to dive really in early 2022. That cyclical economy fell abruptly from 8, 9, 10% growth rates, literally like a diving board, right to zero. And when it hit zero, it was in roughly December 2022, January 2023, right around the time, ironically, that you had the Silicon Valley bank issue. The Fed came in and put a bunch of measures in place like bank term funding program and things like that. And it may or may not be perfectly correlated to what happened. There are many factors at play. But once that cyclical economy hit zero, it took on this L formation where it's been grinding along at zero. Everyone has thought that the economy had this, acceleration in 2023, and then it's slowing again, and now it's speeding up again, and now it's slowing down again. Most of that was just gyrations in the stock market and asset markets more broadly. That cyclical economy fell really rapidly from about 10% to zero, and then it grinded along at zero really since the beginning of 2023, still sitting here today. It's been almost 18 months of pure linear stall speed, which is really bizarre. That lack of cyclicality is somewhat unusual for the cyclical economy. Now,
and that's where, Eric, that's where a lot of this, the debate and argument comes in, because the idea that I think a lot of people have, and it's an intuitive one, right? I mean, if you don't really study the economy too long, you think, okay, you're talking early 2022 since the technical recession in the first half of 2022, which, by the way, that was an important event, as you're pointing out. That was the economy announcing that the cycle was starting to change. It wasn't a recession, but it was something. It was significant, a significant event. But exactly. 2022 is forever ago, and here we are. And you're right; it's been like this ever since. And so I think people naturally push back and think, if it was going to happen by now, it would have happened by now. And the fact that it hasn't happened by now, sort of recency bias, then it's not going to happen. But doesn't that argument go both ways? The economy, the cyclical economy, has been flat, but it also hasn't rebounded and recovered either.
That's exactly right.
Which is an important point to really get into too.
Yep. So we sort of knew the cyclical economy had almost no chance to recover because we take our signal of where the leading economy is going to go from the leading economy, right? So the leading economy tells us what's going to happen with the cyclical economy. Leading economy started contracting in early 2022, which did properly foreshadow the incredible and abrupt slowdown that we saw towards the end of 2022 in the cyclical economy. Now, leading indicators certainly implied that we were going to keep contracting in the cyclical economy, which we haven't. We have grinded sideways.
But there have been, just started up, but there have been contractions around the rest of the world. We talk about, the globally synchronized. I mean, you got Europe in recession, you got Japan in recession. So
exactly correct.
Yeah.
Exactly
so there was a lot to it.
And that's not an accident, right? That's not by accident. So the leading indicators today, though, are really not improving. Which tells us that this stall speed is still likely to resolve itself to the downside. So the beautiful part about this process, and when we go through it, is we can, of course, get deeper and more granular every time. So if we want to zoom in on the cyclical economy, then we can zoom in, let's say, on residential construction. We'll do both residential and manufacturing because we'll, reveal kind of what's going on here. So we can zoom in on residential. Well, residential is made up of several parts. There's single family construction, there's multifamily construction, there's remodeling. And the unique part about this cycle is that those categories that make up residential construction historically are very synchronized, right? Because the availability of money and credit impacts them all almost equally. And what we saw in the residential construction sector was a little bit of a passing of the baton for non-cyclical reasons. So when the Fed started tightening policy early in 2022, you saw an almost immediate nosedive in single-family permits, single-family units under construction. This was in really the summer of 2022. But ironically, multifamily construction was dealing with so many backlogs that they hadn't even started a lot of their construction activity that was authorized in 2020 and 2021. So as the single family construction was falling, you had this rise in multifamily, and it wasn't a rise that people thought that the environment was so good right now. It was just projects that were authorized that hadn't broke ground because they couldn't get materials.
It was it was the leftover from the bubble in 2021. They had all the financing in place, but they didn't have the ability to get started right away. So it kind of dragged that process out.
And to make matters worse, so much of that multifamily construction was regional of investors and funds trying to capitalize on this migration. So you had like hundreds of projects in Florida, and it's difficult to move labor across the whole country to get it all in basically one or two states, which is where a lot of this was happening. So you had this multifamily construction that was hooking up as single family was falling. Then, as monetary policy started to set in more effectively, and you had those backlogs in multifamily starting to clear, you got the roll and the turn down in multifamily permitting activity because rates went up to 4 or 5%. There was clearly no way that anyone was going to be able to profitably build a multifamily, so the permits started to tank. But you had this stabilization that was forming in the single family sector because the Fed came in and, quote unquote, eased policy with the around the Silicon Valley event. Mortgage rates fell pretty significantly. That caused a little bit of activity in the single family sector. So then as multifamily was coming down, single family was rising. So you had this sort of on and off that happened in the residential, which was unique to this cycle.
And there was a whole lot more to my conversation with Eric Basmajian of EPB Macro Research. That's available to Eurodollar University members. We talked about the rest of the business cycle, all of the different data. We talked about what might need to happen in order for the U.S. to avoid a recession and what would be the first time ever. Like I said, a whole lot more to our conversation available to Eurodollar University members. And right now, Eurodollar University is having an anniversary sale where you can get some of the best prices we've ever offered on our memberships and our subscriptions like the daily deep dive analysis and the daily briefing. Check it all out at our website, eurodollar.university, for the memberships, the subscriptions, and the rest of the conversation, the great conversation we had with Eric Basmajian. Can't thank him enough for stopping by at Eurodollar University.